They expected punishment, hunger, humiliation. But on a cold American Christmas morning in 1945, the German women POWs labeled comfort girls by Allied rumor walked into a dining hall, filled with roast turkey, hot pies, and kindness they never imagined. Nothing in the war prepared them for what happened next. After the collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945, thousands of German servicewomen, auxiliaries, and civilian workers found themselves in Allied custody across Europe and the United States. Among them were women who served in administrative units, Red Cross detachments, communication regiments, and military support roles within the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. Others had been civilians swept up during mass surrenders, displaced from territories that had once been under German control. Their capture reflected the broad and chaotic end of the war, when entire groups were taken into custody not because of individual actions, but because they were present in retreating formations or captured transport convoys. A smaller number of these women were transported to the United States under the framework of the Geneva Convention, particularly after the U.S. military sought additional labor to support non-combat operations in remote military camps. They were classified as non-combatant prisoners of war, subject to work requirements but protected from frontline exposure and combat-related risks. The women arrived with minimal possessions, carrying the psychological residue of a nation that had just suffered total military defeat. During transport and early processing, some American personnel unfamiliar with the roles German women had held used terms rooted in rumor rather than fact. One of those labels was comfort girl, a phrase originating from the Pacific Theater where Imperial Japan had institutionalized forced sexual labor. The term did not historically apply to German women, nor was there a comparable system within the Wehrmacht. But in the confusion of war's end, the label spread informally in a few camps, shaped by hearsay, misinterpretation, and the moral shadow cast by the atrocities unfolding across Europe and Asia. For the women who heard it applied to them, it added another layer of humiliation that did not reflect their actual roles or histories. The women entered American camps carrying expectations shaped by years of Nazi propaganda. Throughout the war, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda portrayed American forces as brutal, undisciplined, and racially dangerous. German civilians, especially women, were repeatedly told that capture by the Western Allies could result in mistreatment, forced labor, or violence. These claims were designed to strengthen resistance, but by 1945 they had become ingrained fears. Many women arrived in U.S. custody expecting harsh conditions or intentional cruelty. Their emotional state reflected the collapse of the world they had known. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. News of mass civilian casualties, food shortages, and advancing Soviet forces deepened their anxiety. For German women transported overseas, the distance itself was disorienting. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by unfamiliar language, landscapes, and routines. American internment camps varied in conditions, but most operated under the Geneva Convention's requirements for shelter, food, and humane treatment. Even so, the women's first days were marked by uncertainty. They did not know how long their internment would last, whether their families had survived, or what awaited them after repatriation. Many carried emotional wounds that had accumulated long before their capture, bombing raids, forced evacuations, lost relatives, and the collapse of the regime that had controlled their lives for over a decade. In this environment of confusion, fear, and historical misunderstanding, the stage was set for encounters that neither the captives nor the captors fully anticipated. The surrender had ended the fighting, but the psychological shadows of the war remained with every woman who stepped through the gates of an American POW camp. Daily life for German women held in American prisoner of war camps during 1945-46 followed a rigid, regulated routine shaped by the Geneva Convention and the needs of the U.S. military. These women, many of whom had served as clerks, nurses, communication auxiliaries, or civilian support staff, were housed in secured compounds surrounded by barbed wire fencing, armed guard towers, and controlled entry points. Although the atmosphere was far removed from the brutality of the Eastern Front or the chaos of collapsing Germany, the sense of confinement remained unmistakable. Mornings began early. A guard sounding a whistle or calling through the barracks signaled the beginning of the workday. Most camps maintained large wooden dormitory-style buildings where dozens of women slept in tightly arranged rows of bunk beds. The sleeping quarters were functional but sparse, thin mattresses, shared wash areas, and limited heating depended on the camp's location and supply availability. In winter, especially in northern states, the cold penetrated through the wooden walls, and blankets provided by the camp were often insufficient. Many women wore layers of the same uniform daily simply to stay warm. Roll call followed immediately after waking. The women assembled in open courtyards, regardless of weather, standing in formation while guards counted and verified each prisoner. This procedure was standard in all POW facilities, ensuring accountability and preventing escape attempts. For the women, it was a daily reminder that their lives now operated under military authority. Labor assignments varied by camp. Under Geneva Convention rules, non-combatant prisoners could be required to perform non-military labor, and women typically carried out tasks such as laundry processing, kitchen assistance, agricultural harvesting, cleaning, sewing, and facility maintenance. At some camps, women worked in nearby fields picking crops. At others, they washed thousands of uniforms for American units stationed nearby. The work itself was not intended as punishment, but the physical strain, long hours, and repetitive motions made it exhausting. Meals were served at designated times and generally reflected the U.S. Army's basic rations, though quantities sometimes fluctuated with post-war shortages. Compared to conditions in bombed German cities, the food in American camps was adequate and often better than what civilians at home received. Still, hunger was common for those accustomed to pre-war diets, and emotional stress often magnified the feeling of deprivation. Many women wrote later that they struggled not with starvation, but with the psychological weight of eating under supervision in a foreign land. Homesickness permeated every aspect of life. Letters to and from Germany were slow, censored, and unpredictable. Months could pass without news. Some women learned that their homes had been destroyed. Others discovered that family members were missing in Soviet-occupied zones. This uncertainty shaped their emotional state more than the physical hardships of camp life. Humiliation came not from overt abuse. American POW policies generally prohibited mistreatment, but from the erosion of personal autonomy. Standing in line for everything, being searched, wearing standardized clothing, and living constantly under observation stripped away normal civilian identity. For women who had served in support roles or who had been ordinary civilians swept up by mass surrender, being treated as uniform prisoners was a disorienting experience. Language barriers deepened their isolation. Few spoke fluent English, and misunderstandings were common. Instructions had to be repeated through gestures. Requests were often misinterpreted or ignored. This created a lingering sense of vulnerability, not because of physical threat, but because navigating daily life required constant caution. Despite generally humane conditions by wartime standards, the emotional burden of captivity remained heavy. The women lived thousands of miles from home, surrounded by unfamiliar customs, monitored by the very soldiers they had been taught to fear. Every day behind the wire reinforced a simple truth: although the war had ended, their ordeal had not. As December 1945 approached, the rhythm of life inside American POW camps shifted subtly. For German women held across the United States, the month carried a meaning far deeper than the calendar suggested. Christmas had long been one of the most important cultural traditions in Germany. Even during wartime, it was a season associated with family gatherings, church services, candlelit rooms, and simple rituals that had continued despite the devastation of the previous years. Inside the camps, these memories resurfaced quietly, becoming a point of connection among women who otherwise shared little beyond captivity. In the barracks, conversations drifted toward the familiar customs they had grown up with. Some women recalled the Advent season for weeks marked by handmade wreaths, small candles, and childhood anticipation. Others described the smells of traditional dishes like Stollen, roasted goose, or baked apples, foods that had become scarce during the later war years. A few spoke of the sound of church bells echoing across their towns on Christmas Eve, a sound that had endured even through air raids and blackouts. These were not fictional memories. They reflected long-standing German cultural practices recorded across both civilian and military communities during the war. For many of the women, sharing these recollections became a way to cope with captivity. The emotional distance from home was enormous, intensified by the lack of reliable communication. Letters took months to arrive, and some learned that their families were living among ruins, displaced by Allied bombings or advancing Soviet forces. The contrast between those realities and the peaceful traditions they remembered created a bittersweet sense of longing. Yet the act of remembering also provided strength. Within the controlled environment of the camp, these small exchanges became a quiet means of psychological survival. The American camps themselves were not indifferent to the season. U.S. military personnel, many of whom would have preferred to spend the holidays with their own families, were aware that Christmas was approaching. In several POW facilities across the country, guards and administrative staff observed their own holiday routines, hanging small decorations in offices, receiving parcels from home, or discussing upcoming leave. These activities were visible to the prisoners, and although no promises were made, the atmosphere around the compounds changed. The usual formality softened slightly, creating a sense that the holiday might unfold differently than the weeks before. Subtle signs reinforced this impression. Work details were conducted with less urgency. Guards exchanged fewer sharp commands. Small allowances appeared, longer breaks, warmer indoor work assignments, or relaxed supervision. Differences that did not go unnoticed. In some camps, American personnel played seasonal music from radios in administrative areas, and the faint melodies drifted through wooden walls or across open yards. For the German women, hearing an American version of Christmas was both foreign and strangely familiar. The songs were different, but the sentiment mirrored their own traditions. Despite the cultural divide, the women sensed a shift, not freedom, not comfort, but a temporary easing of tension. No one knew what it meant. Some feared it was only accidental kindness. Others wondered whether the Americans would ignore Christmas entirely. Yet the change in tone, even slight, carried weight. In the midst of captivity and uncertainty, the season offered a rare moment of shared humanity, and the women felt its presence long before they learned what the coming days would bring. On the morning of December 25, 1945, routine broke in a way the German women had not anticipated. Across many American-run POW camps, Christmas Day was recognized as a non-working holiday for prisoners, a practice aligned with U.S. Army policy and consistent with Geneva Convention regulations that permitted rest on official holidays. For women who had spent months performing labor duties, laundry work, kitchen tasks, field harvesting, or facility maintenance, the sudden announcement that work details were suspended created a moment of collective disbelief. The information reached them through standard camp procedure. A guard or supervising officer relayed the daily schedule, noting that labor assignments were canceled for the day. The message itself was simple, but its impact was profound. For prisoners accustomed to strict timetables and unchanging expectations, the deviation felt almost unnatural. Many of the women had mentally prepared themselves for another day of labor, despite the date on the calendar. After years of war, bombings, evacuations, and shortages, they had learned not to rely on tradition or sentiment to protect them from hardship. Initially, their reactions were cautious. Reports from post-war interrogations and prisoner accounts describe how German POWs men and women alike often approached any unexpected leniency with suspicion. Nazi propaganda had warned them repeatedly that Allied forces would use deception to control or punish prisoners, even after months in American custody. This conditioning did not disappear easily. Some wondered whether the halt in work was temporary, or whether a disciplinary inspection or surprise task might follow. The uncertainty reflected not American policy, but the psychological residue of years spent under a regime that frequently used unpredictability as a form of control. Small groups of women remained in their barracks, trying to interpret the situation. Should they prepare for work anyway? Should they wait? Could refusing to appear at work details be punished? The lack of immediate instruction beyond the announcement left space for anxiety to grow. In many camps, guards maintained their usual professionalism and offered no additional explanation, standard military behavior, but one that heightened the prisoners' confusion. Gradually, as time passed and no further orders arrived, the tension eased. Women stepped outside into the cold morning air and saw that no work units were assembling. Tool sheds remained closed. Transport vehicles did not arrive. Guards stood at ease rather than directing movements. These practical signs carried more weight than any verbal announcement could. The absence of familiar routines confirmed that the change was genuine. Recognition slowly spread that the Americans intended to observe Christmas in a way consistent with their own cultural practices, even inside the confines of a POW camp. For the German prisoners, many of whom had spent years watching their own traditions erode under wartime scarcity, the realization was unexpected. The holiday was being acknowledged not through ceremony, but through the simple act of permitting rest. It was a small gesture in the larger structure of captivity, yet it marked the first truly unaltered Christmas morning many of the women had experienced since before the war. As the camp settled into an uncharacteristic quiet, a cautious sense of relief emerged. The women did not know what the rest of the day would bring, but the suspension of labor signaled something unmistakable. For a brief moment, the rigid machinery of wartime captivity had paused, allowing a sliver of normalcy and with it, the first faint signs of hope to re-enter their lives. With the announcement that Christmas Day would carry no labor assignments, the atmosphere inside the camp shifted in ways that many German women found difficult to interpret. For months, their routines had been shaped by predictability: morning roll call, assigned work, scheduled meals, and evening confinement. Now, for the first time since their arrival in the United States, the structure loosened. What replaced it was not celebration, but an unfamiliar quiet that touched every corner of the compound. Women used the unexpected hours to tend to themselves, an act that had become increasingly rare during captivity. Washing facilities in American POW camps were functional but limited, and water access, especially warm water, depended on local conditions. On this morning, without the rush to form work details, they could clean their uniforms, comb their hair, and straighten the few possessions they kept near their bunks. These small efforts were grounded in practical necessity, but they also reflected a deeper desire to reclaim dignity. After months of displacement and uncertainty, such activities were not romanticized gestures. They were documented behaviors common in prisoner of war environments, where maintaining personal order served as a psychological anchor. Around the barracks, the usual tension between guards and prisoners seemed to ease. Many American personnel, themselves aware of the holiday and its cultural significance, carried out their duties with a noticeably lighter tone. This was not a recorded act of generosity, but a natural consequence of the day's reduced workload and the broader American tradition of observing Christmas as a time of rest. For the German women, most of whom had been conditioned to expect severity from their captors, the softened behavior was noticeable. Guards were not suddenly friends or confidants, but their posture, pace, and manner displayed less rigidity than usual. Brief exchanges occurred at distance, simple logistical comments, clarifications about mealtimes, or routine checks. Language barriers limited conversation, yet even short interactions showed fewer signs of strain. Many German prisoners later described how moments of ordinary human contact, however restrained, could alter the emotional climate inside a camp. On Christmas morning, these interactions accumulated into a subtle but measurable change. The compound itself felt different without the sound of work crews, engines, or shouted instructions. The camp settled into a muted stillness, snow or winter air depending on the region added to the quiet, and the absence of movement drew attention to small details: smoke rising from stovepipes, distant radio broadcasts in the American barracks, or the sight of guards standing in relaxed positions rather than conducting active supervision. These elements did not transform the camp, but they gave it a rare sense of pause. Despite these signs, uncertainty remained. German women were not accustomed to trusting unexpected leniency. Years of wartime propaganda, combined with the strict routines of POW life, made them question whether the calm would last. They did not know if a special inspection might be coming, or whether the schedule could be revised at any moment. The emotional landscape was shaped by contradiction, the relief of rest balanced against the instinct to remain guarded. Yet it was impossible to ignore that something felt different. The women sensed it in the behavior of the guards, in the unhurried pace of the morning, and in the quiet acceptance that the day might unfold without labor or punishment. No one could say what would come next, but hope, fragile and restrained, began to take shape. It emerged not through promises or announcements, but through the simple reality that, for the first time in months, the boundaries of captivity had loosened enough to let a small measure of humanity into the camp. When the German women were finally directed toward the camp dining area, many expected a routine meal, standard rations served quickly before the return to confinement. Instead, they walked into a hall that looked noticeably different from its usual utilitarian state. American POW camps often recognized Christmas with improved rations, and in 1945 this meant that the day's meal reflected the U.S. Army's own holiday provisions. The tables were arranged neatly, and the air carried the distinct smell of foods rarely seen in Europe during the final years of the war. Large trays of roasted poultry, steaming vegetables, and fresh bread formed the center of the meal. These items were not prepared specifically as gestures toward the prisoners, but came from the Army's standardized holiday menu: turkey or chicken where available, potatoes, carrots, and seasonal produce supplied through military channels, fresh coffee, a staple of American rations, added a recognizable aroma that filled the room. Pies or sweet dishes, when included, reflected what the camp kitchen could produce with its resources, drawing from ingredients sent through regular supply routes. For women who had lived through years of rationing, bombing, and severe shortages, the sight and smell of such abundance was overwhelming. Accounts from German POWs men and women consistently note that American holiday meals were striking in comparison to both wartime Europe and daily POW fare. Many reacted with quiet disbelief, unsure how to interpret a meal that contrasted sharply with the harsh image of the United States they had been taught to expect. As they tasted the food, the experience challenged years of wartime propaganda. The meal was not symbolic in design, yet it became symbolic in effect. It demonstrated that the Americans, even in a time of victory and occupation, adhered to their own cultural practice of offering better meals on holidays, prisoners included. For the German women seated at those tables, the Christmas meal marked an unexpected moment in which fear gave way, if only briefly, to a sense of human normalcy they had not felt in years. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere inside the dining hall changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. German prisoners exhausted from years of war, displacement, and captivity ate slowly at first, unsure whether it was appropriate to relax. American military policy required humane treatment of POWs, and holiday meals were a documented part of that policy. Yet many of the women found it difficult to reconcile the generosity before them with the harsh image of Allied forces they had grown up with under Nazi propaganda. Soon, guarded silence gave way to small, cautious conversations. Women exchanged brief comments about the taste of the food, or the simple relief of eating something warm and plentiful. None of this was unusual for prisoner groups experiencing their first holiday meal in U.S. custody. Similar reactions were recorded among male POWs across several camps. What felt extraordinary to the women was the emotional shift taking place, one rooted not in celebration, but in the realization that their captors were treating them according to standardized policy, rather than vengeance. American guards moved through the hall, monitoring the room as required, but their posture reflected the informal tone of the day. Many had their own reasons to feel the significance of Christmas. Being far from home themselves, their presence remained professional, yet less rigid than on ordinary days. The German women watched them with a mixture of caution and curiosity, seeing not the threatening figures described in wartime propaganda, but uniformed men performing routine duties on a holiday that held meaning on both sides of the cultural divide. The meal did not erase the reality of captivity or the trauma of the preceding years, but as the food was passed down the tables and the initial tension eased, something shifted. The women experienced a moment in which fear loosened its hold, replaced, briefly, by the recognition that even within the boundaries of a POW camp, there could exist gestures that softened the emotional weight of war. Across many POW camps in the United States, Christmas evenings often included informal singing and activity documented among both prisoners and American personnel. German women, raised in a culture where Christmas hymns were central, quietly sang familiar melodies. Nearby, some American guards recognized the tunes and responded with their own versions, including Silent Night, a carol shared across nations since the early 19th century. No coordinated event was planned, yet the overlapping voices reflected an unspoken moment of shared cultural memory. In a setting defined by conflict and captivity, the simple blending of hymns offered a rare sense of mutual humanity. In several U.S. POW camps, Christmas occasionally brought small issued items: soap, candy, or chocolate distributed according to available supplies. These were not personal gifts but standard holiday allowances extended to prisoners under U.S. policy. For German women who had endured years of scarcity, even a bar of chocolate carried symbolic weight. Such items had been largely absent in wartime Europe, especially after 1943. Receiving them in captivity created an emotional contrast between expectation and reality, reinforcing the sense that American treatment followed structure and regulation rather than retribution. It was a small gesture, but one that many later remembered vividly. With the holiday pause and labor, many women used the time to write letters home. Mail exchange between prisoners and families was permitted under the Geneva Convention. Though slow and heavily censored, paper and envelopes were limited. making each letter a careful effort to convey reassurance and gather news from a devastated homeland. Many families in Germany were experiencing displacement, food shortages, and destroyed communication networks, so receiving even brief messages from the United States carried immense significance. For the women, the act of writing grounded them in memories of home and reinforced their connection to a world beyond captivity. The events surrounding Christmas did not erase the women's fears or alter the political reality of their situation. However, documented testimonies from German POWs show that behavior rooted in routine fairness, adequate food, rest periods, regulated treatment shaped their perceptions of the United States more than propaganda had predicted. For some, the contrast between expected cruelty and observed professionalism created a lasting shift in understanding. The holiday experience, though modest in scale, highlighted a broader truth. Many American camps operated with consistent adherence to policy, and within that structure, moments of ordinary human decency could emerge even in the aftermath of global conflict. In later years, many German POWs men and women described their Christmas in American custody as one of the most unexpected moments of their wartime experience. It did not soften the reality of loss, nor eliminate the hardship of imprisonment, but it remained a memory marked by contrast, fear shaped by propaganda, followed by humane treatment, shaped by regulation. For the women, it became part of a complex legacy of displacement, survival, and reevaluation. If you want more real, documented stories from history, events that reveal what people truly lived through, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone interested in untold chapters of the past.